Within a few days, South Carolina would secede from the Union, followed quickly by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. So last Friday marked the 156th anniversary of the beginning of the Civil War. By April, there would be a direct attack on Fort Sumter, which would prompt 4 more states to secede from the Union. Lines would be drawn between slave and free states until there were 11 states, which formed the Confederate States of America. Both sides considered themselves very patriotic and devoted to their cause. Both thought their enemy was tyrannical, oppressive, and had evil motives. Both were convinced their cause was right and just. And even a more remarkable fact was that both were completely convinced that God was on their side. Both thought that God was speaking to them through the words of the prophet Isaiah. "Here is my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him." 42 verse 1. So the South in particular had some very powerful and persuasive preachers serving in their churches who effectively used the Bible to defend the rebellion and the institution of slavery. Taking the Bible literally, they quoted verses like, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling," Ephesians 6:5. "Let all who are under the yoke of slavery regard their masters as worthy of all honor," 1 Timothy 6:1. "Tell slaves to be submissive to their masters and to give satisfaction in every respect," Titus 2:9. While it is true that these statements were all taken from the Bible, it should also be remembered that they were all taken from letters written to address specific issues by their authors at a completely different time in history, in a different culture. And what is especially troubling is that they ignored the difference between their culture and ours in the definition of the word slave. But these nuances were not taken into consideration by those wishing to prove their point. Many have stated that they took this stance to preserve their way of life. And I also suspect that it was much more likely the motivation was also to protect their bank accounts. The northern preachers drew heavily upon the book of Revelation, suggesting that a northern victory might prepare the way for the coming of God's kingdom. Abolitionists preached that God would not allow the North to win until it made ending the evil institution of slavery their first priority. These beliefs are made very clear in the theology put forth in the Fight Song of the North, the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Especially in verse 4, which reads, "In the beauty of the lilies Christ was born across the sea, with a glory in his bosom that transfigures you and me. As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free, while God is marching on." Don't miss that last phrase. While God is marching on. Not the Union Army or us, but while God is marching on. You see, they saw themselves as instruments in God's hands. On the right. As we can see, both sides were firing theological shots at one another in support of their cause. And before we think, though, the North too noble, it should be said that slavery was not the main issue that started the Civil War. It was just one of several issues. And at the beginning of the war, it wasn't even very high on the list of issues for the North. Some of the main reasons were economic disparity between the North and the South, states' rights versus federal control, the fight over which side new states coming into the Union would be on, and whether they would be allowed to make that decision for themselves. The rise and the growth of the abolitionist movement also added tremendous political pressure on an already volatile political environment. And with the election of Abraham Lincoln as president, well, that pretty much ended up being the last straw for many of the politicians in the South, who saw Lincoln very much as only a Northern sympathizer. Although the issue of slavery was not very high on the Union's list at the beginning of the war, it did become much more prominent as the war continued to progress. Now, there is a danger in becoming too caught up in group identity. Both sides claimed they were acting as the Lord's servant. And as one sage put it, when Christianity and politics are mixed, it corrupts both. There's a great principle put forth in that statement. And I want you to be sure that you don't miss it. You see, our faith should inform and shape our politics, not the other way around. Let me say that again. Our faith should inform and shape our politics, not the other way around. And it should never be used like a club. More than 70 years prior to this conflict, President Washington wrote this: "Religious controversies are always productive of more acrimony and irreconcilable hatreds than those springing from any other cause." From this, we can see how our founding fathers were so adamant to keep religion and religious beliefs out of government. And what was true then is still true today. Another president, Abraham Lincoln, offered an even more constructive and cautious perspective on this topic. When someone made a comment to President Lincoln that God was on the side of the North, he responded this way: "My concern is not whether God is on our side. My greatest concern is that we are on God's side." Well said, Mr. President. The prophet Isaiah was witnessing some of these same issues in his people. He saw that his people were putting too much faith in their national identity, taking pride in the fact that they were God's chosen people, children of Abraham. But they were not placing enough emphasis on following God and doing the things that God wanted them to do. God had commissioned them to be a light to the Gentiles and free the captives from prison, Isaiah says. They were to be in a position of serving others, not to be served by others. So, where are we at as we fight our own little wars? And I don't mean the ones in Iraq or Afghanistan. I'm talking about the little skirmishes we have with the people around us as we live out our lives together. As we raise our children, live in the same house with our spouse, work at our jobs, serve in community organizations, and even debate our political differences with one another. So let me ask, do we ever claim that God is on our side, or are we earnestly seeking to be on God's side? Just give that statement a few minutes to soak in. Are we sincerely seeking to please God and care about the things that God cares about, or are we just trying to please ourselves? Are we as Christians willing to take on the role of servant, as Isaiah describes, one who will not shout or cry out or raise his voice. A bruised reed he will not break, and faithfulness he will bring forth justice. Those who follow God have a mission to be a light to the nations and to work faithfully to bring forth justice. Are we truly on God's side? Christians who do these things will always find themselves in the right place, on God's side. You don't have to read very much of the Bible at all to quickly learn that the Bible is very concerned about people who are often denied justice because of their social status or their lack of power. People like widows, orphans, resident aliens, the poor in general. People who lack power, who have little representation. So one of the tasks of a Christian then is to bring forth justice and bring God's kingdom into our everyday lives. We do this whenever we treat people fairly, with respect, seeing everyone as a child of God, made in God's image. The servants Isaiah describes are not loud or obnoxious or destructive or domineering. They do their work quietly and compassionately, with respect for the people around them, but yet stand strong for their principles and the things that they believe in. He will not grow faint or be crushed, Isaiah says, until he has established justice in the earth. Verse 4. Protesters on both sides of the political spectrum, from the radical left to the far right, should carefully study this passage, I think. The recent protests after the presidential election should make this point very clear. There are better ways to effect change than waving signs, screaming insults, and acting belligerently. As was made very clear by the last election, both sides, I think, need to practice a higher level of civility toward one another, especially in the public forum. True servants of the Lord will always produce more light than heat. They are sent to be a light unto the nations, to open the eyes that are blind, to set the captives free. In the Civil War, the North and the South were fighting over economic issues, states' rights, the issue of slavery. In our own little civil wars, we are fighting about many cultural, political, and theological issues. But the best thing for us is for us to come out on top. Is not to fight harder, but to serve one another better. Serve better, as John wrote in his letter. Always be ready to give an answer for the hope that lies within you, with gentleness and respect. This is how we can win the cultural war as well as some of our own little battles, and hopefully prevent giving Christ a black eye in the process. As we prepare to begin a brand new year of ministry here in the Trenton area, let's focus on what missions and ministries that we can implement in order to make a real difference in this community in the name of Christ. In their book, The Externally Focused Church, the authors make this statement. They say it's not about size, it's about impact. And they ask the question, can you imagine the difference it would make if the more than 340,000 churches in North America all measured their effectiveness by external measures, like the impact that they have on their communities, rather than on internal measures, like attendance? So let me ask, what kind of impact do you feel that we as a congregation are having on this community? How are we making our presence felt? If this church burnt down tomorrow, how many people in the community would notice after a few weeks that we no longer existed? Even more telling, how many people in the community would actually miss us? Have you ever thought about that? As we begin this brand new year, on Monday night we're meeting, we're having a planning meeting. It's just a brainstorming session to get together and say, what can we do? What can we change? What will make an impact? And how can we go about it? So I would invite you, if you're interested in these things, to come and share, to give your ideas. What are we going to do to really make a difference in people's lives? Let's be sure that in the process, we find ourselves on God's side as we plan a new year of ministry together. Let's pray. Loving God, we thank you for this church and for all that it could do to make a difference in this community. Lord, we ask that you guide us as we meet together. Give us new insight, new ideas into